He giveth more grace. When the burdens grow greater, He sendeth more strength. When the labors increase, to added affliction He addeth His mercy. To multiplied trials, His multiplied peace. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power hath no boundary known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus, He giveth and giveth and giveth again. Well, good afternoon. We'll finish up Romans chapter 9 today, and last week's topic was entitled, Is God Unjust? And of course the answer is no, He's not. And today we're going to finish that topic by more evidence for God's justice. Of course, about verse 30, the topic changes. The last two verses of chapter 9 go to the next topic, which chapter 10 is dealing with, and we'll kind of hit on that this morning or this afternoon, but not very far. So I'm trying to take it as my key thought for today, the last verse of last week's section, verse 18. So then, God has mercy on whom He desires, and He hardens whom He desires. God is just. Paul has proven that by showing us the self-hardening of Pharaoh, using the story of Pharaoh to prove that. God's the potter. He made us. Therefore, He has the right of ownership to do what He wants. This was God's approach to Job. If you remember, we as the reader know what's happened in the life of Job, but Job doesn't. Satan accuses God that Job's only serving him for what he can get out of him. God says, not true, test him. And so God allows the devil to allows Satan to test Job. Of course, again, Job doesn't know about that. The reader does. And so in chapters 38 through 41, Job is pretty much saying, well, God, why are you letting this happen to me? Why are you punishing me? Why are you judging me? Why are you allowing trouble? And in those chapters 38 through 41, God's pretty much saying to Job, well, Job, who are you to question me? Where were you when I laid the corners of the earth? Where were you when I put the stars in the heaven? Where were you? Where were you? As creator, He really can't be questioned. He just has to be trusted. And so we must be aware of standing in judgment over God because we don't like the circumstances we're seeing or dealing with or living in. God is judge over us, so we need to avoid trying to create or refashion God in a way that's more pleasant or palatable to us. The fact of the matter is there's some hard topics in this chapter 9 and 10 that goes against our humanistic tendencies, against that which we have inherited from the age of enlightenment. And so we need to be reminded, as verse 21 of this chapter says, that God is the potter. And so Paul continues on this topic to give us two more reasons to prove that God is just and that God's always right. The first one comes in, of course, the first verse here. What if, it's almost like a hypothetical, what if God, although willing to demonstrate His wrath and to make His power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? Paul says that while God is the author of salvation, we are the authors of our own damnation. It does say vessels of wrath prepared. It doesn't say prepared by whom. Evil people are not evil because God made them evil. Evil people are evil because they're born in sin because of man's sin. But, as the text says, God endures. God is long-suffering. He bears with us. No one ever really gets fully what they deserve. And so Paul adds, these objects of wrath are prepared for destruction. The implication seems to be to me in the text is that they're prepared by themselves. Remember in chapter 1, verse 24, Paul says that God turns people over to a reprobate mind because they've wanted the wrong. Now, he's talked about the self-hardening of Pharaoh previously. That's not necessarily just this, because people are born in sin, they're shaping in iniquity, and they do sinful things. And so they are prepared for destruction by the behaviors that they live. Paul goes one step further. Paul says, and he, that's God, did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. Notice in the previous verse, vessels of wrath prepared, but it doesn't say God prepared them. In verse 24, it is very clear God has prepared for glory. That's a different story. Paul wants us to know that God shows forth his glory. God displays his mercy on those that are undeserving. Yes, vessels prepared for wrath by their own behavior, but other vessels prepared for mercy, beforehand for mercy. And this is the heart of the mystery that Romans 9 is really dealing with. Somehow, if God had mercy on all people and saved everyone, and no one went to hell, we wouldn't see the glory of God. Because in order for that to happen, God would have to override everyone's free will. Therefore, the glory of God would not be seen. The glory of God is not only seen in what he does for us and what he allows for us in his mercy and his grace, but also the fact that he permits us freedoms of choice. The biggest question is, if God could save everyone, why doesn't he? And Paul is going to tell us that God has chosen some to save, but he doesn't force or override everyone's free will. This may seem strange to us at the point, but we're not God. And the whole point is he's the potter, we're not, we're the clay. And so how do you deal with the fact that some are saved and some aren't? God is not willing that any should perish, of course. Jesus Christ came for the propitiation for the whole world, but how do we get this together with the fact that some are saved and some aren't? The best illustration I've ever heard comes from James Kennedy's book, D. James Kennedy. He pastored in Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church for a lot of years. In his book, Truths That Transform, he gives this illustration. He says, okay, there's 5 people. They're my friends. James says they're my friends. These 5 guys are my friends. And they've decided to rob a bank. He finds out about it and he pleads with them, please don't rob the bank. We're going to rob the bank. Please don't rob the bank. We're going to rob the bank. So they're getting ready to get in the van to go rob the bank. And he tackles one of them to the ground. And as he's holding the one to the ground, one of the 5 that wants to go rob the bank, as he's holding him on the ground, the other 4 get in the van and escape, go to the bank, rob the bank. In the process of robbing the bank, a guard is killed. Those 4 robbers are captured. They're convicted. They're sentenced to death because of the murder of the security guard. The one who was not involved, of course, was not involved, so he's still free. Now, Dr. Kennedy asked this question. Number 1, whose fault was it that these men are sentenced to death? Well, it wasn't D. James Kennedy's. He tried to stop them. He tried to persuade them. He spoke to them. And what about the other man who's walking around free? Can he say, well, because my heart is good, I'm a free man? The only reason he's free is because D. James Kennedy tackled him and restrained him. So those who go to hell have no one to blame but themselves, and those who go to heaven have only Jesus Christ to praise. Thus, we see here clearly that salvation is by grace alone from the beginning to the end, as Kennedy says. And so Paul has talked to us about the patriarchs. Paul has taught in defending God's justice. Paul has talked to us about the time of the Exodus with Pharaoh to defend God's justice. He picks it up in verse 24. Paul says, even us. Now, you need to be reminded, the first question that prompted Romans 9 was, if the Jews are God's chosen people, then why aren't many of them being saved? And so Paul turns back to this first question, even us, whom God also called, not from among Jews only, but also, let me put that on the screen, but also, let me begin reading the top. Even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. As he says also in Hosea. Who is he? God. Who is Hosea? The Old Testament prophet. And so he begins to quote. Paul is going to quote from Hosea, and then in a minute we'll see he quotes from Isaiah. But the first is from Hosea. And the quote is, I will call those who are not my people, my people. And her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. Now, what matters is not physical descent or ethnicity, but according to verse 24, God's calling, even us whom he also called. He has called Jews and he has called Gentiles. Now, again, I mentioned as we looked at the patriarchs in verses 4 through 7 of this chapter, and then the Exodus verses 14 through 18, but Paul now has moved to the time of the prophets. The function of the 4 Old Testament verses that Paul is going to quote here, 2 here and 2 in the next verse. Excuse me, let me let my dog outside the door. So, according to the Apostle Paul, as he quotes from Hosea here, he's trying to show them that the Jewish record clearly reveals that although the Jews are called his people, not all the Jews are his people. Some who were his people went into captivity. Some who were his people were idolatrous. And some of those who were not his people became God's people. Think of Rahab, the harlot from Jericho. Think of Ruth, the Moabite woman. So Paul is quoting from Hosea, who's prophesying about what was going to happen to ethnic Israel in the exile. He says, some were not that are, and some that are not. He's kind of using this as a template to say this is what God is now doing with the Gentiles. Although the Jews are generally God's people, not all the Jews followed God. And although the Gentiles are the pagans, not all the Gentiles remain pagan. Paul is saying to the Jews, you know God has always been the God who blesses those who do not deserve it, those who could not have predicted it. So if God would bless people like Rahab or Ruth, then the Gentiles flocking to Jesus Christ should not be that big of a surprise at all. And now he's quoted from Hosea to prove that. He goes on to quote from Isaiah. He says this, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. Though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly, and just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of Sabaoth has left to us a posterity, we would have become like Sodom and would have resembled Gomorrah. The Old Testament history shows that the Jews that God blessed were not all of Israel, not ethnicity, quite the reverse. Had God had God acted without mercy, had God not acted without restraint, Israel would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. And speaking to the exile, as Hosea was, Isaiah says, only the remnant is going to be saved. Israel is facing God's judgment. Many of the Jewish people die in their sins. And it's only God's mercy that a remnant is saved. Otherwise, they'd have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. And Paul is saying, you know God has always been the God who rejected those who thought they deserved it and blessed those who didn't think they deserved it. Kind of goes to God resisteth the proud but giveth grace to the humble. God is a God who keeps his promises, but he keeps them in ways that oftentimes the human mind doesn't predict. And he is a God who is utterly free to choose to give mercy to whoever he wants to redeem whoever he wants to. And although he has made the Jews his chosen people, he doesn't have to save all of them and let all of them go to heaven when they've rejected him and become idolatrous and rebelled against him. It's mercy that there's a remnant saved. It's mercy that some are saved. And so God is a God who gives mercy, but then he also allows those who choose the destiny of rebellion to have the destiny of rebellion. Paul continues to write, what shall we say then? Based upon the patriarchs, based upon the Exodus from Pharaoh, based upon what Hosea said, what Isaiah said, what shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness obtain righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. Let me just stop right there. Gentiles were not trying to be righteous by good deeds, but they obtained righteousness by faith. Verse 31. But Israel, contrasting, but Israel pursuing a law of righteousness did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They weren't pursuing righteousness by faith. They thought they had to earn it. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. The situation Paul has been describing all along in Romans 9 is that there's a growing majority of Gentiles in the church and a diminishing number of Jews in the church. In general, the Gentiles are more responsive to the call of grace, more so than the Jews who followed the Old Testament ways. The odd reality of the situation is depicted by Paul in that striking statement in verses 30 and 31. We've read 30 and 31. That striking statement where he says, the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it. Now, what does that mean? I think that's something of an understatement. The unbelievers, as described in Romans 1, first did not have a full picture of righteousness. They were not like the Jews. They hadn't been given the law. They hadn't been trained the law. They hadn't been taught the law. But ironically, though they lived wicked lives, they were more open for the gospel. They were more open to receive the gospel. It is my contention, and I might be wrong, but my contention that to some degree, Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, as well as the pre-Socratic philosophers and those that followed soon after, prepared the European world, the Greek world, the Roman world to receive the teachings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you ever have opportunity to read Socrates' apology before he was put to get death by drinking hemlock, you'll see in his defense of there's only one God, clearly laying the foundation to accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God. And the Gentiles who were not given the law, who had not been taught the law, had not grew up in the law, were open to receive the good news of Jesus Christ. On the other hand, the Jews who had a deep awareness of the law, been taught the law, been trained the law, knew that they needed righteousness to go before God, rejected Jesus Christ. Because unlike the Gentiles who accepted the righteousness of Jesus Christ, the Jews were seeking righteousness by works, by their own efforts. And because they sought to create their own righteousness, that stood in the way between them and God. Their own righteousness was the stumbling block. Jesus was the stumbling block because they refused to receive his righteousness because their righteousness stood in the way. Now, I think you can already make the comparison here, but I'll make it for you if you hadn't. You can see verses 30, 31, and 32 is basically telling the story that Jesus Christ told in the chapter of lost things in Luke of the lost son, the prodigal son. The prodigal father has two sons. One is a younger son who lives riotous, wicked living lives. The other is an older son who always did what the father told him, always lived by the rules. Initially, the younger son is lost in his wickedness. The older son is lost in his goodness. At the end of the story, the young son has come home, and now he's saved. He sees and respects and appreciates the deep love of the father. The older brother is still pouting and complaining. Now, here's my question. Do you think once the younger son came home that he tried and sought to live by his father's rules? Absolutely. The difference was when he came home, the older brother's still living, by the rules out of obligation, out of duty. I'm a good person. I'm doing what's right. The younger son is living by the rules because he loves the father. There's an Old Testament story. It's called the Law of the Love Slave, where if someone has been the slave of a master for 6 years, and in the 7 years, the year of release, the master gets ready to let the slaves go free, and their debt's been paid, whatever. The slave may say, hey, my life with the master has been better than my life without the master. And I don't want to stop being his slave. I don't want to leave his household. I want to stay in his home. And the Old Testament says that the master could take that slave out to the fence post of the road and take a awl and bore through his ear and put a ring in it. And that ring would say, I'm serving my master simply because I love him. So if it had been, somebody been in the marketplace and seen this slave just working hard, doing all he could, they would immediately think, well, that's a hard taskmaster. Look how hard that slave is having to work. But then when they got closer and saw that ring in the slave's ear, they'd immediately say, oh, he's not serving the master out of obligation. He's serving the master simply because he loves him. That's the difference between the older brother and the younger brother. The younger brother is serving the father because he loves him. The older brother is basically doing it out of duty. That's what this verse is saying. The Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, but obtained it by faith. The Jews, however, pursued the law of righteousness by works, and so they stumbled over the stumbling stone. Let me read you a quote. This quote comes from Richard Lovelace. It says, it's from his book, Dynamics of Spiritual Life. He says, we all automatically gravitate toward the assumption that we are justified by our level of sanctification. And before reading further, what he's trying to say is human nature. We're born in sin, shaped in iniquity. We're ego-driven people. Automatically, naturally, we gravitate toward the assumption if we live better lives than other people, we are better than other people. That's not true, but we think that way. Even as Christians, we think I'm a better Christian because. So we start each day with our personal security resting not on the accepting love of God and the sacrifice of Christ, but on our present feelings or recent achievements in religion. Now, let's just be honest. We oftentimes end up being the older brother in the church. And we think, well, I'm better because I've done this, I've done that, I've served here, I've served there. There's a right kind of fear and a wrong kind of fear. There's a right kind of pride and a wrong kind of pride. And the wrong kind of pride is thinking that you're a better Christian, that you're moving the needle to be more saved because of what you've done. Lovelace says that's not true. Sadly, we start each day with our personal security resting on the wrong thing. Not on the love of God and the sacrifice of Christ, but on our present feelings, how we feel, or our recent achievements in religion. It goes on to write, since these arguments will not quiet the human conscience, we are inevitably moved to a self-righteousness which falsifies the record to achieve a sense of peace. I know I'm going to heaven after all I've done. We say it. If anybody went to heaven, they made it after all they did and after all they served and et cetera, et cetera. We all tend toward self-righteousness, and that's what happened. When the world changed for the Jews and Jesus Christ came and died for their sins, they couldn't give up the comfort they found in works-based religion. So much of Christianity suffers because of works-based religion. But let's get to the last verse of this chapter to prepare us for the next chapter. We're already in the next section, but we'll come back to it next week. Paul goes on to write, just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. The first half of verse 32 explained what Paul meant by his assertion the Jews have stumbled over the stumbling block. There is an offense to the cross. That stone is Christ, as Paul writes to the Corinthian church in chapter 1 of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, the stumbling block to the Jews, because Jesus says, take my righteousness, I don't need yours. That's a stumbling block. And why do people stumble over Jesus? Because faith in him requires that we lay down any idea of self-righteousness. We lay down any idea I've got to earn it and accept his righteousness. Faith means that I'm trusting only in what nothing in my hand I bring, simply to the cross I cling. And as long as anybody is seeking for salvation as if it were by works or legalism or whatever, they will stumble and they will fall when they're confronted with Christ. Because Jesus died for me means the only way I could be saved is if God himself died. Jesus died for me is offensive because what it means is no matter how good I am, it doesn't matter. In the final scheme of things, it won't move the needle and one iota toward salvation. And Paul is showing by combining the quotations from Isaiah 28:16 and Isaiah 8:14 here in Romans 9:33, by putting those two quotes together, Paul is showing us that Christ is a rock. He is the rock upon which we either found our lives on or we stumble over. As Paul pointed out in verses 4 and 5 of this chapter, the Jews had all the light they needed to see that Jesus Christ was the rock of salvation, the rock in which anyone could trust, the rock in which you can anchor, the rock will never put to shame. Anybody could see that in verses 4 and 5. The Jews had all that light. But instead of seeing the natural transition from the Old Testament law to the righteousness of Christ, rather than see that as pictured in the sacrifices and the sprinkling of the blood, they stumbled over Christ. As someone has said, they tripped over their own robes of self-righteousness. And yet, Paul has been careful to let us see salvation is entirely God's work. Our damnation is entirely our work. Now, I know the bulk of this chapter, up to verse 29, is basically being attributing the fact that God is sovereign. He shows mercy on whom he'll show mercy. He forgives who forgive. Those who were not my people are my people. Those who were not beloved are now my beloved. So when we get into this next section, which begins in verse 30, we see that Paul has been dealing with sovereignty. Now he's beginning to really deal with human responsibility. And these two things seem to be contradictory. God saves whom he saves. But we're called. We should surrender. We should believe. There's a word that, do I have it here with me? Yeah, I do. Here's a really good book. J.I. Packer, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God. I struggle with why bother with evangelism if God is sovereign? And many Baptists have. Many all Armenians do. If God is sovereign, then what does it matter? So we can't believe it. Well, Packer introduces this word called antinomy. Antinomy means two things that apparently are in contradiction, but aren't. A famous example for that, I don't think he gives it, but a famous example of that is light. At times, light behaves as particles. At other times, light behaves as waves. We don't really know how this can be because it's apparently a contradiction in physics, but it's not. We just don't have enough information to see how it's not yet. Well, that's the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. It's not a contradiction. It looks like an apparent contradiction. We just don't have all the information yet. And so the Bible never says, this event happened totally in accord with God's plan. Therefore, human beings were never responsible for their actions. The Bible never says that. The Bible never says this was God's plan, man was responsible for nothing in it. Nor does the Bible ever say human beings were responsible for their actions. Therefore, the event was not certain to happen until it happened. God was waiting for man to decide. It doesn't say the one. The Bible holds these two truths together very clearly for us to see that they are both truths of God. It is an antinomy. It does seem to be an apparent contradiction because we don't have all the information yet, but these truths are true. The complete sovereignty of God over all of history and the complete responsibility of every human being for his or her behavior. Salvation is entirely God's work. Damnation is ours. So trust God. He's given us some more evidence. Isn't it great to know we're a child of God because he has called us and made us his forever? Well, I hope the study's been a good blessing to you. We'll be in chapter 10 next week. Have a great day.